Coming up on the Woven Energy podcast.
Given that we're a civilized species, because of our safety net is, we have the opportunity to respond on an inappropriate level. The first stage in becoming a shaman is first to become an animist. If you're not an animist, then there's absolutely no point whatsoever in becoming a shaman. For this particular exercise, try hard to find somewhere where there is no sensory input from things that human beings have created. If a fist or foot is winging towards your body at a very high speed, there is no time for a committee meeting, and that they tried to remedy it by drawing people's attention back towards the natural world. And Fan Kuan did so in unbelievably brilliant style in this particular painting. In our society, a lot of people put on a face to the world. We're conditioned to do that. I'm not saying that the shamanistic state, can only be achieved in that situation. Of course, it can be done anywhere. It can be done sitting in your room at home.
Hey, we are back once again with the Woven Energy podcast. This is episode 4. I'm Joseph Sikora, and I am here once again with Damon Smith to talk about shamanism from the ground up. And I really do feel like we're hitting our stride with this episode. This has been one of my favorite episodes so far. It's something which is quite personal to me. And we're going to be talking about how we are, what we call biased to the baseline, biased to the receptive realm, biased to the roots of the tree, the time. This is one aspect of the tools which nature have given to us. Remember, we talked about in episode 2, we talked about the three realms being three aspects of the great cycle. We can also think of the three realms as ways in which we connect to the outside world and ways in which we deal with problems or deal with situations we face through life. And so it's interesting to see how, as a civilized species, we've become biased to only one of those tools, one of those realms, and how this has affected our lives. So in this episode, we go into some examples of certain problems that we have to deal with and how the three realms relate to those. We look at why we're actually biased as a civilized people. We look at what it actually means to be biased to the receptive realm. How this bias affects relationships, how it affects business practice, and that's really interesting. And towards the end of the episode, we take a look at a Chinese artist called Fan Kuan, who actually realized all this 1,000 years ago and painted a magical painting to kind of depict this and try to get people to realize this. And right at the end of the episode, we give you an exercise, a real exercise you can do to try and address this within your own life. So I really hope you enjoy this episode. It's my favorite so far, and I hope you get something out of it. So this is episode 4. Hey, Damon, how are you doing?
I'm good, Joe. How are you doing?
I'm good. So I wanted to kick this podcast off by talking a little bit about something that happened to me this week. And it got me thinking a lot about why we wanted to start this podcast in the first place. So the TV was on. I'm not a hermit, so the TV was on, and there was this quiz show. And it was obviously quite a high budget thing. It was prime time, and there was expensive lights, good music, and it looked all slick and posh and everything. And there was this fairly overweight contestant, and this quizmaster was like, "So, are you ready?" And he goes, "Yes, I'm ready." And he goes, "Oh, good. Are your family here?" And he goes, "Yeah, they're up in the audience." And so the camera goes up to the audience and shows them, and they're all like looking dead proud and waving and stuff. And then he goes, "Right, are you ready?" And he goes, "Yes, I'm ready." And the timer starts. And so all this build-up, I'm thinking it's going to be some like general knowledge thing or something. But the timer starts and the camera zooms out, and there's a big long table with 20 melons on it. And I kid you not, he starts headbutting and smashing every single melon over and over again for a minute and a half. And I'm like, what is going on? What is this? I was not expecting that. And to top it off, at the end, the quizmaster goes over to him and he goes, "Oh, sorry, mate, but you failed." And I'm like, failed? How the hell has he failed? He's just been smashing melons for a minute and a half. What is going on? And, I don't want this podcast to turn into some sort of social commentary or anything like that. But this was one example that got me thinking about how there's this hypnotic kind of background fog to society. And it's so easy to get trapped in that cycle, that sort of cycle that keeps us all hypnotized and in this sort of state. And we're all just coasting along. And I was thinking, just taking a step to the side of it or just poking your head above the waters is something that can be a truly a good experience. And
Sure.
so that did get me thinking about what you said in a previous episode about how we are biased to the underworld. We're biased to the roots of the trees since we became civilized. And I thought that would be a really good exercise to explore this episode so that people can kind of get an idea of what it means to be biased to the baseline and then use that knowledge to maybe do step outside of this fog a little bit or begin to just peer through the veil and see life for what it's really all about. So
Yeah.
how about we take a look at the baseline then, or the roots of the tree, the tam, and how it compares to the creative realm and the manifest realm.
Sure. Well, I think your question is relevant to the task that we left you with last time, which was to go away and have a look at a painting by a Chinese artist, Fan Kuan. That painting is very, very relevant to your question. Fan Kuan was obviously somebody who was strongly aware of human beings' bias for the baseline, as it would be understood in China, the tam. That bias is not a natural bias. If you think of how any animal, not just human beings, but any animal responds to the challenges that it faces in its life, there are a number of different ways and a number of different levels on which it can respond to any given challenge, or any given problem or difficulty that it has to overcome. And you can see underlying these different types of responses, each of the three realms that we described last time.
Animals have a natural tendency to use all three realms.
Yeah, I would say that in general, wild animals, are quite good at making appropriate use of each of the three realms in their daily lives. They have a slight advantage over us in that they tend to be adapted for a particular way of life, and they tend not to stray too greatly outside of that. Human beings, on the other hand, certainly over the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, have strayed hugely outside of what you might consider our natural way of life, and we to a certain extent assail ourselves with complexity, and we seem to have a almost relish creating more and more complex structures, both social structures, technological structures, and in some senses, we talked about exoteric structures. The exoteric structures that we've created are of phenomenal complexity. The wild animals, on the other hand, when they face difficulty, they respond very appropriately, because they can't afford to do anything else. Their environment punishes them if they don't respond appropriately to challenges that the environment throws at them. Since we became civilized, the root of the word civ, the civ root, relates to the early city-states in the world. And so I'm using the word civilized not as a value judgment, just as an indicator that as a species we have placed importance upon cities or settled ways of life, sedentary way of life.
We've created structures around ourselves which disconnect us from nature in a way that we can survive without relying on.
Well, they disconnect us from nature only at a certain level. I think, as we said another time, it's impossible to remove ourselves from nature because we're part of it. But what they do is create a buffer zone. If you think of a rather simplistic example, just the walls around one of those ancient city-states, they stop people. They stop. They control the flow of people into and out of the city state. But they also stop the wild animals coming in. They basically act as a buffer zone. And so if I behave and react inappropriately when I'm out in the jungle, if I'm a hunter-gatherer, and I respond in the wrong way to the challenges that nature throws at me, I'm likely to end up, dead, frankly, or in serious trouble that I'll have to extract myself from. If I start behaving in a somewhat delusional way within a walled city, the punishment, I may be punished by social elites unless I am one of them. But the punishment from nature is not there. I've reacted inappropriately to a natural challenge, but the immediate punishment is not there. I stand a much better chance of survival. And this is where, the opportunity for exotericism to arrive. I can now start believing things that aren't, that would get me killed if I was out in the jungle. I can start believing that no wild animals can tear me limb from limb. No wild animals can assail me because of my faith in my exoteric belief system, because my faith will protect me. Believing that in a walled city state is a lot safer thing to do than believing that when you're out in the jungle, surrounded by things that might want to eat you. So you can see where the opportunity to respond in an unbalanced way to challenges arose. It arose because of the buffer that was funded by the agricultural surplus. But why should we? Why should we do that? That's a different question. So let me give you some examples of challenges and where it would be appropriate ways in order to respond to them. So if we take the modern muchir, the branches of the world tree, the branches and leaves of the world tree, which would be Tengar, the spirit, the underlying spirit of the creative realm.
Which in shamanism would be the upper world.
Yeah. If we take that, a challenge.
We know they're all the same thing, but there we go.
A challenge that I might come, a couple of examples of challenges that I might come across in my life is, one is that I want to choose who to marry. The particular civilization that I found myself in allows me to marry one person. And just on a hypothetical basis, say there were two people who I was quite keen on marrying, and a nice situation to be in. Which one of those people should I actually marry? That's a question, because coming together in a close relationship with somebody is of the spirit. That's a question that I shouldn't really be answering using a kind of automated dating agency type tick box methodology. Create a spreadsheet of the salient attributes of each of the people concerned, and then give them scores, and then it's a dreadful way.
The hypothetical good and bad list.
It's a dreadful way to select a life partner. That's something that would be much better accomplished using spiritual methodology, spiritual technique. I won't go into what that would be, because that's for another episode. But something akin to the spirit journey is something that I personally would apply for that type of a decision. If we move on to Modni Ichbi, the trunk of the tree, the trunk of the world tree, a number of different examples that I could give here, but suppose I was an elderly lady or gentleman, and I was living in a neighborhood where there was a lot of gang activity. I'm living by myself. I'm in my home, so I have a certain level of protection. But I know that in the street outside, there are people who are living a life that's rather raw. And I might feel some fear. I might feel threatened by the fact that they're there. this is a fear is something that we experience quite often in life. Another example would be if I'm waiting for a job interview, and I've been going through what I should and shouldn't be doing in the interview in my mind. I'm worrying about what I'm going to do. I feel apprehensive, and I can tell myself not to be apprehensive, but it doesn't seem to work. So an appropriate response in Dihil, in the middle realm, in the manifest world, is actually to fear is actually a physical response, because that's what we've naturally been accustomed to before we became a civilized species. If something attacks us, out come the spears. It's that kind of physical response. So what I would say, for instance, one of the ways I personally have responded to something like that, the job interview type of scenario, is I would just excuse myself for a minute and go into the loo, do 50 push-ups. Not that I can do that anymore, but one time I could. And at the end of the physical activity, you feel much better. If you could just imagine a hypothetical scenario of a car backfiring in the street, it may startle people. They don't know what the loud noise is. And just suppose at that point in time there was a marathon race starting. You might get a lot of people turning around and maybe a bit of concerned look on their face to see what the loud noise is, the sudden loud noise. But at the end of the same marathon, if a car backfires there as they're crossing the line, they're probably not very bothered, because of the intense physical midline activity they've been involved in. The fear response, the reaction response will be greatly reduced, because an appropriate response to a middle realm, manifest realm problem is a physical response. Well, physical response is one of the appropriate ways of responding there. Of course, what happens is that we don't always respond in that way, but we'll come on to that in a moment. Just let me talk about the Tam, the underworld, the receptive realm. A problem that I might have in that it would be absolutely appropriate for me to respond in that realm, or give a response that's associated with that realm, would be a bug in my software code. So I'm sat writing a software program, and there's a logic error in the code, and I really need to get the bottom of why that's occurring. So I follow the code through in my mind, step by step, checking what all the variables are, checking at each line of the code what the conditional logic is, and I work out in my mind what the problem is, and I fix it. There's an appropriate response to an appropriate problem on the receptive realm, type of response to a receptive realm appropriate problem. Of course, given that we're a civilized species, what we tend to do, because of our buffer zone, because of our safety net, is we have the opportunity to respond on an inappropriate level to different types of questions. So, for instance, the first inappropriate response, at the Tengar, at the Moji Mochi, the branches and leaves, the creative realm, would be to literally create a spreadsheet in order to choose my wife, or to go on a dating agency and allow their software program to match me up with salient attributes of another person. If they do that in a very logical way, they say, "Oh, we've got a lot in common. Myself and somebody else have a lot in common, a lot of things, activities in common." We'll probably find that yes, we have a lot to talk about because we have a lot in common. Maybe we're both interested in some activity, climbing or something of that nature. Mm. But what you'll also find as that relationship progresses is that two people being the same on a logical level is not in any way a basis for a relationship. And this is one of the reasons why that I put down to for instance, the very high divorce rate in our society, is that people with similar interests have social opportunities to come together, and they also have something to talk about early on. And I believe that, for instance, dating agency type of mechanisms to a certain extent exacerbate this problem,
Well, of course,
by making it formulaic.
Yeah.
And effectively turning a top-line issue, who should I form a life partnership with, into a baseline issue, into a TAM issue, as if it's something to do with logic or reasoning, as if I'm fixing a piece of software code. And really, that's a completely inappropriate and not very effective. And as I said, I really believe that this is we can maybe go into this in long-term relationships and what the three realms mean for long-term relationships in a later podcast. But I really believe that this is one of the root causes of the very high level of divorce in our society.
Well, it's one of those things that could really help people out as well. Yeah. I think because of the society that we're in and the fact that we do have jobs, not only do people meet on dating sites like that, but they also meet in the workplace, which obviously sometimes, I'm not saying this is all the time, it's not like that, but, there's more of a chance that you're meeting somebody who is perhaps not the best life choice in a life partner.
Well, it's the point that I'm trying to make, and I'm not one to set up a dating agency here, but the point that I'm trying to make is that decision, whether people are going to have a productive partnership together, is all about the spirit. The other lines are only involved. They're only involved in terms of relationships. They're only involved at the start of a relationship, as a relationship starts to get going. But the top line is what sees it through. Is what sees if it's mutually beneficial.
Well, it's an example of how these three realms can apply on a multitude of different levels. Because you were talking in a previous episode about how we relate to each other just in general, not talking about relationships or anything, just life partner relationships, but just between you and somebody else in general. The top line is the thing that somebody sees last in you, the creative realm, and then there's the middle realm that they get to know, but the first thing they see is your logic, the way that you interact with the world, and then
and also in our society, a lot of people put on a face to the world. We're kind of conditioned to do that. I want to impress other people, so I behave in a way that's probably not my natural way of behaving, and ironically, I make it harder for them to see. For them to approach my spirit, when really probably what I want to be doing is making it easier. But what I was coming to is that I've mentioned that we don't, as a matter of fact, unlike wild animals, we don't tend to respond in terms of the appropriate realm to a realm specific question or to a realm specific challenge. But what I would also say is the way in which we don't respond well is not random. There's a definite pattern to it. And the definite pattern within our species, since we become civilized, is to have what you would call a TAM bias, a baseline bias, a bias for the mud nuke, for the roots of the tree. And this is seen in the workplace quite widely, with the propensity for people to hold excessive amounts of meetings. We're sort of taught as we go through life that we need to plan out everything in advance. We need to make sure we don't make any mistakes. We need to analyze things up front, and come up with a plan. If you like to use a very old and business methodology, a Gantt chart. That's from the early 20th century, 1910. I believe it was first used. That methodology, although it's been conclusively demonstrated to be a bad one, it's still widely used in the world of business today. And the reason for this is that we think, because of our buffer, that we are more powerful than we actually are. And for instance, in construction projects, in development projects, everything being planned out in advance, wherever that hits hard reality, what people find is that it doesn't actually work. So that planning in advance, that logic, that reasoning all through, that's all receptive realm stuff. That's all baseline stuff. It's the mud nuke. It's the tree roots. It's us trying to be logical about it. So one of the great things that I've always loved about martial arts is that is that there's very immediate feedback. You can't get too delusional. You can't plan out everything in advance, you know. I mean, if I imagine a simplistic scenario in martial arts, I will do the heavenly warrior technique and then I'll defeat my opponent, you know, and then my opponent knocks me out. You know, it's not like that. There's no, if a fist or foot is winging towards your body at a very high speed, there is no time for a committee meeting. And it's one of the things that, you know, that there's a midline problem for you if ever there was one, you know.
So what needs to be a problem. It's a lack of being able to test in the receptive realm, because in martial arts, you're testing all the time. You test. And if your technique doesn't work, you get smacked in the face. If your technique doesn't work on the baseline or in the receptive realm, nothing happens.
Sure. Well, it's also that we don't, I forget who it was that said, no plans, it was military general. I think there were a couple of them. There was a German guy and an American guy. But basically they said no plan survives contact with the enemy. So in esotericism, you tend to find esoteric teachings aren't about planning, but rather about preparation. They're developing a skill set, and they're developing a flexible framework for reacting to difficulty and problems that may come up, or issues that may come up. That isn't like a plan. It's more like a set of tools. If you like, shamanism is nothing other than a set of tools, a set of techniques. If you think of it as a toolbox. Now, I don't know whether I'm going to have to, speaking metaphorically, as a shaman from one day to the next, I don't know whether I'm going to have to put in a screw or hit in a nail. But I want to have both a screwdriver and a hammer in my toolbox just in case. I don't want to say it's definitely going to be a nail, therefore I only need a hammer on my Gantt chart. That's it. It doesn't work like that. Life and nature don't work like that. They can appear to work like that only when you have a buffer zone. And actually, if you look at the empirical evidence, regarding the big fill projects that you hear about, especially they often associated with government, where millions and millions of pounds have been spent developing some piece of software that eventually gets abandoned and is never going to be finished. Those projects almost always exhibit a strong modni uch, a tree roots bias in their formation, and that the underlying rationale of those projects is all based on the false misconception that you can plan out in advance everything that's going to happen, especially if it's a complex piece of software that takes quite a long time to develop. You don't know that even if you do it perfectly and you do a good job of planning out and building that piece of software, by the end of the time that you're developing it, you don't know that the time has moved on, the market has moved on, the people who use it don't want to use it anymore. And in recent times, in the business environment, there's a methodology called Agile, which is more balanced, or has more balanced traits. It's still baseline bias to a degree, but nowhere near as the older way of doing things that has come to the fore recently and had some more success. And shown that, you know, small teams of people can actually outproduce, working in a more balanced way, can actually outproduce and outperform large teams working with a heavy tree roots bias. And so coming back to the homework that we set,
I just want to give you another example from my own experience, just doing these podcasts with you, because it's like, if I try to plan too much, say I wrote down everything I was going to say and every question, it never works. It's almost like there's a flow, an energy to the situation that's born out of and from within the situation that we're in, the situation being the podcast episode. And trying to plan too much in advance cuts that natural flow. it stifles it, because I'll always be thinking back to the planning stage. It stops having a sort of presence, and sooner or later you have to step out of this rationalizing and planning stage and sort of flow within the situation. The skill is like being able to direct it within the overarching theme without having to think things through too much whilst doing it. That's like using the baseline or receptive realm too much in what I'm doing. It's best and feels the best when we become present within the moment, within the situation.
Let me give you another example of what you're talking about. During the sort of latter half of the 1980s, I used to get involved in martial arts demonstrations. So they might be quite popular now, I don't know. But at that time, you would get a bunch of different martial arts groups would get together in a auditorium or stadium or something of that nature, and they would put on like a show, and the different martial arts would show their things, and there'd be an audience. Usually it was the friends and families of the people in the martial arts clubs, and I did quite a few of these during the latter half of the 1980s. But one of the things that I found in the course of doing that is, if I planned out in advance what I was going to do in that demonstration, then I didn't get a very positive, good reaction from the audience. If I didn't plan, if I just switched my mind off and told somebody or other to attack me, I got a much more positive reaction. I think because what was happening looked more real, more natural.
Yeah.
But for
people
whatever
can sense
reason,
authenticity, can't they? And natural vibe.
Yeah, and that's true in a lot of different things in life. It's certainly, I was involved in teaching at one point in time. It's certainly true in teaching. It's quite funny. There was one time I taught in a college, and there was an inspector coming around to validate my teaching techniques, and I was woefully inadequately prepared for this particular lecture. So I just went in and I totally winged it. And afterwards I got tremendous feedback on how great and engaging the lecture had been, and which just came as a shock to me. I thought, it had to be this particular lecture. So I think that one of the ways, being spontaneous is not always as disastrous as or as risky as people in our society think it's going to be.
I think a lot of our audience will be into self-development on some level, and there's a lot of terms thrown around in self-development, but a few of them are this concept of flow state, or what's the other one? In state. They call it being in state, or being in a state of flow. So how does that relate to the baseline bias? Because when you talk about presence and being spontaneous, that is like, it's like, I've experienced that flow state and it's a good feeling. It's like everything works. People respond to you really well, and you just have energy and people understand you. You're funny, and it's just such a good world to be in. It really is.
Yeah. So I use the word flow slightly differently. But that has to do with the flux of the energy. As we were talking about the steps through which a shaman goes in order to prepare for and make the spirit journey. But I understand that usage of the word flow, and I would say that has some relationship to the Baktamshe Sab, the Chilicity that we mentioned previously. Yeah. And it's being a true animist. If you want to think metaphorically, it's leaning back and resting upon nature. It's allowing nature to be your prop. And it often has much better results than you think it's going to. And I think that one of the things that's conditioned into us from an early age is this idea of a logical analysis of risk. But one of the agile methodology that I mentioned earlier, which is kind of a business world application of some of these ideas, is kind of showing and proving that the analysis, the upfront planning, the baseline bias, the TAM bias, is a risk in itself. If you were to come from another planet and look at all these failed projects that have been planned out in minute detail before they were ever started, and then a very large number of them failing, you would say, well, that's not a very good approach, But for whatever reason, it's the way most of us in the business world seem to think that things have to be, and they really don't. So if anybody's interested in business methods, I would highly recommend reading up about Agile. There are a few different agile methodologies out there. Extreme programming is from the software world. Scrum has been used is one that's been used in the software world and elsewhere as well. And then there's a thing called the Agile Manifesto, which is quite interesting. But actually, these things harken back to earlier times. A practice known as Kanban. Maybe we'll talk about Kanban at some point in time, which most people think was invented by American advisors working in Japan after World War II, in the reconstruction of the country, but actually is much earlier than that, and actually comes from the Japanese underworld. It comes from, what I'm saying is it comes from originally from esoteric groups within Japan, which was one of the early, there's a guy, Toyota, called Taichi Ono, who applied some of this knowledge and had quite a lot of success with it. But maybe that's a the application of shamanism and esotericism in the business world. Maybe that's actually several podcasts in itself.
We need to make a list. We need to make a list of all these ideas.
Yeah, and we do need to get onto the subject of the homework, which
we do. But this is just a good example of the reason why we wanted to start this podcast in the first place. Because laying the foundation of shamanism, it's like you cannot say it's just shamanism. And you were saying before, people think when they've categorized something that they understand it. And really, shamanism encompasses shamanism and animism together encompass.
That's right.
Everything. How we deal with the world, how we exist.
And understanding something in the roots of the tree, in the modern yuch, is not true understanding in the shamanist conception. It has to be understood modimochia, monichbi, modich, all acting together as one entity. That's real understanding. Yeah. And
people want to rationalize certain concepts within shamanism as well, which is another example of baseline bias, like literal spirits and literal talking to the dead and literal things that go against our go against what's real,
Yeah, and also, this is probably for a later podcast, but understanding is overrated anyway. It's to a certain extent to do their job, to perform. For instance, the spirit journey. A shaman doesn't really need to understand anything. They need to know. They need to understand up front how to. But I don't mean just on the baseline. They need to understand how to get themselves into that state. But once they're in that state, nature teaches them. They don't need to do anything. And that's the great thing about it. Achieving the shamanistic state is hard. And taking on the discipline needed to take that shamanistic state in a useful direction is hard. But having achieved those things, the actual thing is easy. You don't even have to do that. That's something that's done for you. Yeah.
Another example could be language itself as the baseline. And that presents itself so much in the fact that we're using so many terms for the same thing. So when we talk about baseline, I'm just clarifying. When we talk about baseline, we're talking about it from the Chinese perspective. We talk about TAM. We're talking about it from the Mongolian perspective. It's all the same thing.
Exactly the same thing.
It's all the same thing.
But you're right. Human beings having this inbuilt desire to approach things from the baseline. Hence my slight reluctance initially to do this podcast. It is a problem. But the question is, in our society, if we want to make shamanistic technique available to more people, is there any other way of doing it? How I've historically done this is what we talked about, is one-to-one with people who I know very well, people who are self-motivated, people who really kind of drag this stuff out of me, rather than me having to persuade them to do it, if you see what I mean.
What I liked the most about it was the fact that it was extremely pragmatic, because I've read a lot about shamanism and a lot of it didn't sit well with my view of the world. And when you start talking about it, it was very pragmatic, it was very real. It felt like, oh, okay, well, this makes sense, you know?
Sure. And again, that's to be a shaman, you want to be a shaman rather than an esotericist. There's a higher vault to jump over, for being a full shaman. Then you have to think about that safety buffer being gone. You have to get rid of it. An esotericist, on the other hand, there are aspects of both shamanism and animism that are useful within our society that are nowhere near as challenging as that. So, and both pathways are totally valid, given that what we've done, given that we have created this thing we call civilization, that they're both valid activities,
Yeah. Okay. So we set the homework of, homework, whatever. We set the task of looking at the painting by Fan Kuan called Travelers Between Mountains and Streams. Was it Travelers?
Yeah, Travelers Among Mountains and Streams. So obviously the title is in Chinese anyway. So, yeah. But let me give you a bit of historical context to Fan Kuan's time. He was working. He probably loved his work as an artist. In what's known as the Song Dynasty in China. The Song Dynasty was a period during which China was reunified after a period of kind of intense kind change, during which China effectively disintegrated. Not just disintegrated, it kind of nobody knew really what nationality they were. Earlier than that, there had been earlier dynasties, like the Tang Dynasty, which had unified China as a nation. And then all of a sudden the whole thing broke up in these small kingdoms that were all not very friendly with each other and trying to do each other over, frankly. And it's known very poetically as the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, but it isn't a period of time that I would have chosen to have lived in, frankly. And coming to the Song Dynasty, when China had been reunified, there was a lot of questioning about what did we do wrong? How did that go so wrong? The Chinese people even today have a great respect for the Tang Dynasty. And I think we had this wonderful thing, this wonderful civilization that we built with all these tremendous aspects. It was so strong. It was so solid. It seemed to just work perfectly. And then all of a sudden it collapsed into a mess. And how did that happen? And what a lot of people came to realize at around the time Fan Kuan was active was this had happened because there are inherent flaws in the idea of civilization. There are inherent, which again we'll go probably into in a later podcast, but there are inherent weaknesses.
You need to write these down, Dave.
In that way. There are inherent weaknesses in that way of, if you want, doing social business. And it does tend to come in waves with periods of with a lot of distinct unpleasantness when things rejig themselves. You can think of the fall of the Roman Empire. But in this particular time when Fan Kuan was active, it had been the fall of the Tang Dynasty and then the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. And then the Song Dynasty reunified China to a certain extent before yet more trouble. But anyway, we'll maybe go into that at a later date as well. But so this is Fan Kuan was part of a movement who believed that a lot of the stuff that had given rise to the greatness of Chinese civilization, this sort of esoteric shamanistic understanding of the world that enabled them to take control of agriculture, take control of irrigation was very, very important, take control of the waters of the world. It had been the esotericists, it had been the shamanism who had given them this capability in the first place. And they thought that what had been lost during the later years of the Tang Dynasty and the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period was this connection to the natural world that had enabled that greatness in the first place. So they tried to bring it back, and they tried to remedy it by drawing people's attention back towards the natural world. And Fan Kuan did so in unbelievably brilliant style in this particular painting. Now, the painting, hopefully you've seen it by now, or you have it in front of you perhaps, has three distinct layers, and you can see them. There's a very small tam, if you like. There's a very small baseline, which is if you can give you a point of reference, if you can see in the bottom right corner, there's a little pack train with some donkeys or mules and some ghostly little human figures. And what they're walking on top of is the kind of gap between the baseline, the tam, the roots of the tree, and the midline, which is above them, which is the thing that has the flowing river coming down the middle of it. The top line, the Tengger line in Mongol, is the huge towering mountain range that's up above and dominates the picture. The interesting thing about this is that Fan Kuan, at some point in time, again on another podcast, we'll go into the 8 trigrams and the 64 hexagrams and what they mean in esoteric terms. But what Fan Kuan has painted is effectively 2 trigrams. Hopefully everybody has seen the 8 trigrams. The 8 trigrams in Chinese culture, the Chinese investigated these 3 realms to a greater level of detail, again on the baseline, than anybody else. You could argue that real shamans don't need to do that because they have a capability that allows them to answer things not on the baseline. But anyway, the painting, a broken line, in the Book of Changes, the I Ching, represents a yin line, and a solid line represents a yang line. So in this painting, the top line, the big top line, the towering mountain is solid. It's a solid line. The midline is definitely broken. There's a river running through it. That's a yin line. And the baseline is recently filled in. So if you look at it, it's like it has been broken. And then in the middle, there's a great wodge of stuff that looks like it's been sort of dumped to fill in a hole. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail about the 8 trigrams because we certainly don't have time for that on this episode. But just to give an idea what those 2 different trigrams that are shown there, the trigram that's shown with the broken baseline, the broken midline, and the solid top line, that's what I call it in English shard, again in Chinese. And that represents a separation, a cutting. So what Fan Kuan's saying is that there has been a separation from nature. With that line filled in, it becomes a yang line. That becomes what I call in English kindle, which is li in Chinese. That's literally like the word kindle. It's like the start of something new, the kindling of something, some energy that's put into a situation. So when we do spirit chants, when we put new energy into a situation, when we introduce new energy, in English, I refer to that as kindle. And so what Fan Kuan's saying is the purpose of this painting is to kindle something new in the person who's looking at it. He feels that the person metaphorically being the whole Chinese people, he feels that they have lost something because of the separation, because of the shard, the broken solid. Trigrams are read from the base upwards. That something has been lost, and he wants to kindle something new in them. He's filled in the baseline and made this kindle trigram. And in order to do that, he's shown what they need to do. He's rebalanced. He said, you guys in the Chinese of the time are far too biased about this baseline. And you can see the little people in the wagon train, or it's not the wagon train, sorry, in the pack train. They're walking along like tiny little ghostly figures, looking down at this baseline like it's so important. And actually, they're missing the majesty of nature that's towering above them. So he draws this roots of the tree, this baseline. In this painting is Chinese, so it's the baseline. He's drawn this relatively small. The midline is a little larger. Yeah, but the top line is enormous. It's more than half the painting. And so what he's saying is in order to kindle something new in you, in order to grow something new in you as a human being, to bring you back towards shamanism, esotericism, and that connection with nature, you need to rebalance your lines in this way because you're so biased the other way. His feeling would be that if he was to paint, what human beings of the time he felt they were like, he would draw an enormous baseline, then a smaller midline, and a tiny top line. And so what he's doing is saying, here's the spark. This is how you need to reorganize your life, reevaluate your view of the world, and place much more important on those things, those non-logical things, those things that aren't about rational planning, about, the cut and thrust of human interaction, the politics, all that kind of stuff. Because look where that approach got us. It got us this great upheaval that had gone in China beforehand. And so one of the things that's very obvious in the painting is that these tiny little human beings relative to the great grandeur of nature. I think that's what we said in the previous podcast when we're talking about the importance of when you make the spirit journey of stepping outside and looking back at the three realms as one. That in that way you don't get focused in like we're taught to in school, and as we grow, you don't get focused in on that baseline. You see the whole picture. And so what he's trying to do is rebalance. Obviously, for a wild animal, if Fan Kuan was painting this for a tiger or a butterfly or something, he would have painted all three lines exactly equally. But he wasn't painting that for those people. He was painting it for us, for you and me, for civilized peoples, and we can still benefit from what he painted today, because I think it's a wonderful piece of art. There is more symbolism in the painting. If you look at the top line, the tenger, in terms of the trigrams, the top line, the creative realm, you notice that there's a waterfall cascading, a slender waterfall cascading down from the heights. This is representative of what I talked about, the fact that people who were very able in matters of the top line, in matters of the spirit realm, had given rise to the situation they saw themselves in. So this is like the flow of our inheritance from our ancestors coming down to us. Now in ancient China, the ancestors of people were characterized by brother and sister, Nuwa and Fuxi. Now, Nuwa being the sister and Fuxi being the brother. And the fork in the waterfall represents the separation of these two spirits. Of course, they're not real people. Well, they may have been at one time, but the allegory, they're two spirits, or two aspects of the spirit that's handed down to us from our ancestors. Nuwa represents the natural technique, the closeness to nature that shamans enjoyed, whereas Fuxi, who in legend is the person who invented, the writing system and fishing and cooking and all that sort of stuff, effectively he invented civilization. He was the first sovereign, the first Wang, if you like, of China in legend. He invented this idea of kings and all that kind of stuff. He's characterizing civilization, whereas Nuwa is characterizing esotericism, the survival of shamanic technique within settled societies. The interesting thing about the fork in the waterfall is that the fork that goes, the side of the fork, left-hand side of the fork, as you're viewing it, that falls straight down, becomes the great raging torrent that runs through the middle of the picture. It's the flow, it's the flux. When we go into spirit dance, we'll be talking a lot about this, I use the word flux, this flow, this weave of energy. When we get onto that subject, this represents the weave of energy, the great stream of energy that runs throughout nature. But the fork, the little fork that goes to the right, it falls straight down. You might have to zoom in to see where it falls straight down to, but it falls straight down on the roof of a Buddhist temple. And that Buddhist temple is symbolizing civilization. It's symbolizing that fork is Fuxi, it's not Nuwa. And it's symbolizing that the birth of civilization ultimately came from these shamanic techniques. So in a way, the the issues with society and civilization that shamanism or esotericism enjoy today. Shamans have no one else but themselves to blame. But it does also show that Fuxi and Yuhua are joined together. Now, if you look up Fuxi and Yuhua images of them, you often see them as like twisted around each other, as if they were inseparable from each other. And it was shamanistic technique, pure and simple. What's happening in Fan Kuan's painting is, of course, they're separating, and that's what you refer to. So when you say we separated ourselves from nature, yes, that's what the fork in the river is representing. So that's a quick review of that painting. There's so much there that I don't think we're going to cover much more than that on this episode, but we will do.
Well,
we'll get to it.
I mean, it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I think we can revisit it at a later date when,
Sure.
when our audience have got a little bit more into what we're talking about and a little bit more foundation of the kind of angle that you're coming from with respect to shamanism, because
sure, but just to reiterate the fundamental issue, the fundamental point here, what Fuxi is suggesting to us all is that we realign our interest, our involvement in each of the three realms, our focus on each of the three realms, such that we become biased, as we see it, towards the top line. We probably put a bit more effort into the midline, and we de-emphasize the baseline. That's only because we're so biased the other way as a species and as a civilization. And I'm not sitting on my high horse here. I'm no different from anybody else in that respect. So it's a realignment. Just to reiterate, in the natural world, what you're aiming for as a shaman is objectively to make use of all three lines appropriately, which would be roughly equally in the natural world. But we're not starting from that point.
I think another idea for another episode we could do is an episode on the top line in general, just like what it means to be on the top line. If we were going to bias the top line, what would society be like? That kind of thing. That'd be quite interesting to explore.
Sure.
So, well, that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think we could wrap this podcast up now with a bit of, unless you've got anything else to say, but I've just got one last thing to go over.
That's fine, Joe.
Well, I was thinking, we've talked about being biased on the baseline, or the roots of the tree, the receptive realm, and the tam. We've talked about being biased to that. What exercises, what physical exercises, what could somebody do actively today? I mean, I was talking earlier about my TV episode, and that hypnotic state that we all seem to be in respect to society. What could somebody do to elevate themselves out of the baseline and kind of get a flavour experientially of the midline or the top line?
Well, we talked about that already. The first stage in becoming a shaman is first to become an animist. Shamans were spiritual specialists with the animist community. It's if you're not an animist, then there's absolutely no point whatsoever in becoming a shaman. So what I would say, I think this is also along the lines of the chelicity that we've mentioned before, is one of the things that I do quite a lot is I try to find myself. It doesn't have to be all the time. It doesn't have to be every day. It can be during a holiday. If you live in the middle of a city, this may be impossible. But I try to find myself a location where there are no sights and sounds created by human beings. That's quite difficult in terms of the sound. But I go out into the natural world. I mean, fortunately, I relocated partly for this very reason. I live in a wonderful, beautiful piece of countryside that still has quite a lot of wilderness around me. But this is only the last couple of years. Before that, I lived in a big town, as you know, and it affords me the opportunity to do that more often. But my advice would be, at some point in your life, or at some point in time, try to make the effort to. I'm talking about alone. I don't mean with other people. To go and find a place where you can just be. Go there, practice your chelicity there, and what I mean by that is try not to think. Think of yourself if you imagine your spirit being like water in a bottle. You throw water in a bottle into the ocean. If the bottle's got a cork in it, the water inside the bottle and the water in the ocean don't mix, although they're both water. Now think of yourself like that. But when you do this activity, instead of thinking yourself like that, try to be like a tea bag. Try to go there, achieve felicity, and be like a tea bag. Try not to be separate. I mean, you can try too hard. I don't mean on the baseline. Don't will yourself. Just feel like you're part of the place. Don't put too much pressure on yourself, because that'll force you down into the tree roots, frankly. Just go and be there. But for this particular exercise, try hard to find somewhere where there is no sensory input coming to you from things that human beings have created. I mean, sound, sight, sodium light coming from street lights, anything like that. I know it's very, very hard, and maybe some people won't be able to do this, but that's a very special thing. It's a very, very special thing. And,
well, I think it's something that could happen over time if you practice it, isn't it? It's
sure. And I'm not saying that the shamanic state, the shamanistic state can only be achieved in that situation. Of course, it can be done anywhere. It can be done sitting in your room at home. That's not what I'm saying. You asked me specifically, what kind of thing can people do in order to readdress the tree roots versus the branches and leaves bias. There's an activity that I do personally, increasingly as I go through life. And I can tell you it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But it is, as we said before, it's animism. It's not shamanism. It's
interesting as well. You said do it alone. Because that's another misconception, I think, with a lot of shamanic teachings out there. It's like, let's go off together. And, it's something, that's something you can experience on your own, isn't it?
In shamanism, a teacher, the word teacher is not good. A teacher, and again, another thing we can go into, a shaman, you can't teach shamanism. You might want to, but you can't. What you can do is act as a guide. People can only do shamanism themselves. In order to, you can guide others. You can give them the benefit of your own experience of following what some in pre-modern Japan was called the Honmichi, the natural path. But it's not something you can teach. As soon as you start putting it into a syllabus, as soon as you start teaching it, it ceases to be shamanism. It starts to be yet another form of exotericism. So think of, I mean, it's apprenticeship in shamanism. Think of it as very much as a guiding process. And maybe we'll talk about how hunter-gatherer societies in former times, and to a certain extent still today, those few that survive, how they bring people on, which is quite different from our modern ideas about training and teaching and education and all that kind of stuff. And that provides a lot of insight into shamanism and esotericism as well.
Yeah. Right, Devon. I think this has been a great episode. Thanks ever so much. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Been good. We'll see you next time.
Cheers.